Bienvenidos, everyone. This is Que Onda. I'm Dr. Mari Castañeda, and I am here interviewing folks from the community and from the 5 colleges and from the region about what are some of the issues of the day and what are the kind of concepts and issues that folks are grappling with, particularly in higher education. And today I have with me a very good friend, Dr. Vanessa Rosa, who is Associate Professor of Critical Race and Political Economy and Latinx Studies, and also co-chair of the Department of Critical Race and Political Economy at Mount Holyoke College. So I'm so excited that she's here today, and we're going to be talking about her book, Precarious Constructions, Race, Class, and Urban Revitalization in Toronto, that was just recently published last year. But so first of all, welcome, and I'm so glad you're here, Vanessa.
Thank you for having me, Mari.
First, before we jump into talking about your book, I wanted to ask, first of all, how did you become a professor? How did you come to higher education, to the academy, and then also ultimately to Mount Holyoke College? Because I just feel like it's so important to share those stories of how do we come to these spaces, given that there's so few of us in higher education as well, as professors, as doctors, with PhDs and so forth.
Thanks for that, Mari. It's a long story, as you can imagine. I'm a first generation college student. My parents did not go to college. My dad actually got his GED in prison, and my mom took a few credits at a community college. But I think it's important to name that as a first gen student, that the path was not straightforward or easy. And, so many, I think, of our colleagues often are following in the footsteps of their parents or other members of their community where it's very familiar to them. And that certainly was not the case in my own experience. Although both of my parents, I think, were deep educators and loved the idea of learning and really instilled that in myself and my brothers, who are also both educators. And so when I went to college. I did an undergrad in political science at the University of Ottawa. And I imagined that I wanted to be a diplomat and travel and live in different places. However, one of the things that I encountered along the way and really found in college is that learning didn't come easy for me. I really struggled in school and was kind of a straight C student. And it was hard. College was really, really hard for me. And it wasn't until I kind of started reading women of color feminist thought and texts that really resonated with my own experience that I really kind of shifted. Something happened. I think we describe them, I think, as teachers as like an aha moment, and that certainly was the case for me. I had two really amazing professors, Dr. Paul Surratt and Dr. Catherine Trevenin, in my undergraduate degree in studies, who really fostered that in me and that type of curiosity around the texts, again, that resonated with my own experiences. And so through that process and through their mentorship, frankly, I decided to apply to graduate school. And so I applied to graduate school and I did a master's in the sociology of education at the University of Toronto. And then I went on to do my PhD at York University, also in Toronto. So all of my studies were done in Canada, which I think is also a little bit rare and maybe different from the context that we're in here in Western Massachusetts. And so I did my doctorate because I loved my project, which we'll talk about today. So I won't say too much about my project right now, but that really was what kind of carried me through, is this desire for ideas, a real belief in change and a real belief in justice, and thinking about housing justice, which again, I'll come to in my later comments. But one thing that I found in my PhD program, like I had found earlier in my studies, is that the classroom was not a friendly place for me. And I felt very excluded for a whole variety of reasons and had a kind of a hard time finding my place because I really was, I don't think, a kind of typical PhD or doctoral student. And so towards the end of my studies, it just became clear to me that the academy was not a place for me. And so just a year before I finished, I kind of decided I don't want to go on. I'll finish, barely. I think I crawled to the finish line of my doctorate, finishing my dissertation, and 10 years ago this year, and decided that I was going to go into the private sector. And so I did that, which is a strange path, I think, for especially a sociologist. My PhD is in sociology. So I had worked for a few years as a consultant and kind of not-for-profit work. I worked for a major foundation, which I loved. I like giving away other people's money to organizations that are doing really transformative economic and social justice work. And moving into the private sector, I felt like I really brought some of those skills. And I think one of the reasons in that space, or why I stepped away from the academy, is I never felt like I could be my full self. Like, I wanted to bring my full self. That's just who I am as a human. You're going to get all of me. And I couldn't do that in the academy. And it's not that I could do that in the private sector, but that I had a little bit more time and kind of freedom to figure out where I was headed next in my own career. And it certainly wasn't the private sector. I learned that fast as well. But it was really a period of exploration for me that time after my PhD and before coming to Mount Holyoke. Now, you asked, how did I end up at Mount Holyoke? Which is kind of a funny story. I had applied to a few jobs and postdocs in my last year of grad school and didn't land anything, which was fine. I think that's kind of common. And so then when I decided to step away, I wasn't really thinking about the academy at all. One thing I was thinking about, though, was teaching. I love being in the classroom. And so even while I was working in the private sector, I taught several classes, either a night class or some online classes, because I just love working with students. So that was kind of always a draw and a connection for me, is the work in the classroom. That I found transformative. But not a lot of institutions value teaching. And so again, it was a kind of a trade-off, and can I be my whole self and like my real passions and what I believe in?
Which is so odd that they don't in some cases, because that's what the institutions are made up of, students.
Students,
You know,
that's our whole purpose.
yeah.
I always say that as like a center in my own teaching and career, is when I wake up in the morning, if I'm ever feeling a lull or what am I doing, I'm like, what am I doing? I'm here for the students. I'm here to learn alongside them and to think about better worlds. And the best place to do that is the classroom. Bell Hooks said that. The most radical place in the academy is the classroom.
Absolutely.
And I believe that. I believe that. But back to in terms of the journey and thinking about teaching and higher ed and how I ended up here right now in Western Massachusetts, I had one postdoc application that a friend of mine, or a friend and a sibling, said to me, you should submit that one more time. So I'm working in the private sector. It's September 2014. I'm just finishing up my PhD. I have no energy or desire to kind of write a new application for something. And so I submitted it to the Consortium for Faculty Diversity, which is a postdoctoral fellowship that tries to increase the presence of faculty of color in the liberal arts. And so this is in September 2014. I'm sitting at my desk in this very boring job in end of January 2015, and I get an email from Becky Packard at Mount Holyoke College who says, hey, I have this application in front of me. Are you still interested? And I thought, Mount Holyoke College, where the heck is that? And what application? Did I submit something? I didn't even remember. It was not on my radar at all. And I interviewed for the postdoc actually on my birthday. And the next day or the next few days, I got an offer from Mount Holyoke. And a few months later, I arrived, and I've never looked back.
Oh, what a blessing. And the thing that's been so great is having you part of the 5 colleges, which is so amazing. For folks that don't know, the 5 colleges made up of Mount Holyoke College, Smith College, Amherst College, Hampshire College, and the University of Massachusetts Amherst, which is where I'm a professor as well. And so the nice thing about the 5 college community is the ability to bring together faculty and also staff and students to connect on not just in the classroom, but also in community-based work and other various, kind of opportunities and initiatives that take place. So thank goodness for that sibling who nudged you to apply, because I think that it's been, I know from knowing you for already many years, what a wonderful gift it's been to have you as part of the community, as well. And I think that I love the fact that you also mentioned the reality and the honesty of how hard it was, both at the undergraduate level and the graduate level, because that's the piece that we don't really talk about enough. Because oftentimes if we're demonstrating that we're struggling or we're having a hard time, there's also this fear that people are going to interpret, then I shouldn't belong here.
That's right.
Or I don't have the capacity.
That's right.
And we're always hearing these stories and really a bias and narrative against students of color that oftentimes they're in the academy, they're in higher education, they're in universities and colleges, but they don't have the skill set and they don't have the ability to perform, which is absolutely untrue. But the other thing is that a lot of these institutions have to change the way they are engaging with us as students in the classroom. And I know that you completely really think about that in the classroom space as an educator. And I don't think universities entirely do that enough. I mean, there's certainly lots of wonderful people that are doing it, but there's so much more to be done, in that area. Because even if we are struggling, that's okay. I mean, that's the thing that is just so bizarre, that it's okay to struggle, then step it up as an educator to really think and figure out, how do we make sure the student then succeeds? What is it that they need? How do we work together? And clearly you had professors that did that, right? Because it was their encouragement and belief in you that then led you to finish up at the BA level, continue the master's and PhD, and then that now you're also doing that with your students, as well.
Yeah. One of the ways I often describe that or think about that in my own work with students and even colleagues is you meet people where they're at. And it's our job to do that work. And it's hard to do that because it requires a particular set of, I think, or type of vulnerability that you bring into work with colleagues and particularly with students. Students are often really struggling. And that was my case. I lost my dad in the halfway through my senior year of college, and I lost my mom right before I finished my dissertation, and I almost didn't finish. I almost didn't finish because I was going through all of these real struggles on the day-to-day. There were things that people didn't know. I was driving back and forth to my hometown, which was 3 hours away, every week for almost 2 years to care for my mom, and while writing my comprehensive exams, and we weren't allowed to talk about that. We weren't allowed to talk about those real struggles and the hurdles. But I think that makes me a better teacher because I see my students as full humans in the classroom and that they're bringing in all of this weight in the world. There's a genocide going on. They're having these day-to-day struggles with their peers, with their families, and it's about seeing them and acknowledging this. The classroom is a space of love and transformation. And if we want it to be that, we have to up our game, like you said, as teachers, and bring a real empathy into learning. And that's not, this conversation around standards and rigor. I'm like, I don't know what that is.
I know. That comes up a lot, especially as the dean of the honors college.
It's a way to exclude people, though. That's not that language. It because there's an embedded assumption that we're not doing that.
Exactly.
And I refuse that assumption.
Absolutely.
Don't, if you want to go there, sure. We can have a theoretical debate or some deep, that's fine. That doesn't mean that because I enter the classroom with empathy that I'm not a rigorist. I have the absolute highest standards. And I think it brings out the most of my students. They know they got to come. They better show up in class. They better do the readings. And often they've done the readings twice or 3 times because they know that's my expectation. So it's not about that empathy or meeting students where they're at. It isn't about learning or how much work they're bringing in. I just don't look at it that way.
Absolutely.
That's not a framework I'm interested as a teacher in engaging with.
And the thing is that they're there.
Yeah, right?
I mean, how many, just in terms of how many folks are actually going to college, you know what I mean? Despite the attacks right now on higher education and all the things that are going on, just in general, the percentage is still not very high.
Yeah.
And so the fact that the students are already there,
that's right,
already means that it demonstrates their own desire, commitment, engagement. So they're here. Okay, so how do we make sure that we keep them here and get them to the finish line?
That's right.
And as opposed to weeding them out, which I think sometimes a lot of folks and faculty and sometimes even staff think that's the way to go, but that really is not necessarily at all going to not only help that student, that's not going to happen. In terms of the student really succeeding in the way they want to succeed and should be succeeding and want to succeed, and we want to see them do that. But also, how does that even impact or bring positive impact in their communities, campus communities, the community at large, we need strong, good leaders that are empathetic. How do we begin that in the classroom?
That's right.
So to demonstrate that.
Yep.
And then both leaders and researchers and scholars that are really thinking these ideas out and are curious and trying to unpack them, as well.
Yeah.
Which is, I'm so glad that you're at Mount Holyoke and so glad that you're in the classroom, because I know that your students do experience a transformation there. Having met some students, I know that your space in the classroom itself is something that students really feel loved and heard, and they really feel like they belong. So I'm so glad that you've been there and that you continue, because you're going to be there for a long time, right?
I am. I'm not going anywhere. I'm
Exactly.
happy. It's because it's a place that lets me do that.
Yes.
I don't think every place lets you do that, but it lets me do that.
Well, that's the thing.
I feel supported.
And that's the thing that, just talking about, the few numbers of Latinas in particular that are professors in higher education and the academy, when institutions exactly let us do what we need to do, when they allow us to teach the way we need to teach, do the research that we want to do in the way we want to do it, engage with communities, it makes us feel not only invested in the spaces that we're, in our students, but then we feel like, yes, I want to stay.
Yeah.
And I want to be here and I want to give back and contribute because I feel valued and I feel seen and I want to continue doing that great work here. I mean, I feel like that's also been one of the big reasons I've also stayed at UMass so long, because I feel that same way, that I feel supported and I feel encouraged, that allows me to do the things that I need to do in the way that feel best for me, in the way that I want to do them. And it's wonderful to hear that that's exactly the case for you too.
It is.
Because if more institutions did that, actually, I think we would have a higher rate of more folks of color, more Latinas staying in the academy, staying in higher education, which a lot of times folks are leaving and saying, this place is not for me. Like the moment that you were like, I'm not sure if I can stay, and what a loss that would have been, if that really ultimately would have happened. But I think if more institutions did that, I actually think that we would have more diversity and more a feeling of community that sometimes are not there. And not the case every institution, but in many cases, folks didn't feel like, I wish I could feel that I really feel valued here. As well.
Well, one of the reasons I'm still here is because of you.
So
when you think about, though, being here and what it means, part of that is mentorship and care. And I think, you have hundreds of students or have had in any given semester, and yet you take your time out to mentor and care for other faculty of color, and particularly Latinas in this, not just here, I know that's all over the country. And so I think that should be named, that part of what makes it livable, and not just livable, like thriving, because I do feel that I'm thriving here and in this space, but that's because of community. That's because of community. It's because of mentors like you and people who have not only paved the way, but like open up space and continue to curate that for the rest of us. I think that that's something, we do that for our students, but we don't often talk about it as colleagues, of that type of love and care that goes into making the academy a real space of transformation.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Vanessa. I mean, it really does make a difference for us feeling that we want to stay and be in community with each other. And it's true that it's oftentimes not named and not always captured in our CVs and our, whatever, annual faculty reports. And in some ways, those things are the invisible pieces, but it's also the pieces that also give you so much life, right? And they make you thrive. And in some ways, I do kind of like the fact that it's not always entirely seen maybe by the institution in some ways, because I do want it to be acknowledged and valued, but at the same time I also like to keep it for myself, in the sense that this is a part of the world that is for us, that we get to support each other, and it's really wonderful to have that space. So thank you so much for sharing, because I just think it's important for people to hear that story, of how we come to these spaces, because they're not easy to get here, and not easy always to stay. And so what is it that makes a difference in our ability to continue staying and continue thriving, as well? So your book, I'm so excited. I've loved reading your book. And I want you to talk about, and I know you already mentioned a little bit about the project that you were doing when you were in graduate school, and how not just the curiosity, but the inspiration that you felt, and you wanted to do the study and then continued on for the PhD. But what was it about this particular project that said, like, I got to examine this. I got to look at this. There's something going on here that needs to be documented, written about, analyzed, examined, and really put in as something that needs to be part of the record, of what's going on in this community.
Sure. I'll start by maybe telling two stories if that's okay. So the first story that I often tell is so my mom was from Toronto.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah,
Oh,
she
okay.
was actually grew up on the border of one of the neighborhoods that I write about. So she didn't live in the public housing project, but she lived in subsidized housing a block like on the next block over.
Okay.
My dad grew up in Harlem in public housing. And one of my last trips to New York City with my dad before he passed away, we picked up my grandmother who was in her 90s. She lived in Queens at the time, and my dad wanted to take us on a tour of the old neighborhood. And so we jumped in the car and we drove through Harlem, and it was interesting. I had never, as an adult, I think, experienced this part of my dad and this I mean, he was always a storyteller, but his the way he narrated the inequality of block to block. So he would kind of point out, and this is just at a moment where I am at the same time reading women of color feminist thought and all of these amazing kind of theorists and books around inequality. And then I have my dad mapping his kind of personal experience onto that and describing this visually in the urban landscape. I was like, oh, this is cool. Like, that is not, inequality is not cool, but the idea that we can see this spatially is fascinating to me. And here I'm, 21 years old and thinking, oh, this is really interesting. And so when I went on to do my master's, my master's was kind of a backdrop to this project, which was around I called it the racial geography of Toronto's Regent Park, which is the oldest housing project in Toronto. And at the time that I was writing that, just about a year before, the city council had passed legislation that would then allow for the redevelopment of this public housing project. So I was thinking more historical at the time, and then now there's this kind of contemporary thing happening around the redevelopment of this very old, underfunded housing project in Toronto. So I turned my doctoral work towards that, which is the foundation of this book. And so I said I would tell two stories. So my second story, I thought I'd start by talking about a woman that I met in Toronto who lived in Regent Park for many years, and her name was Chandra. And Chandra worked at the community health center. And I met Chandra because at the time I was working at a women's literacy center in Regent Park. And through that, I was introduced to a whole bunch of people in the community, and Chandra just really stands out to me. She was very active in the community, a community organizer, loved her neighborhood. It was really who she was, and was quite distraught about the revitalization process. She believed in better housing. She wanted better housing in Regent Park. But she was concerned because in the initial years of the redevelopment, some things that she saw resembled gentrification. And gentrification as being this process where, there's many stages and different types of gentrification. But in this case was thinking about a Mercedes-Benz factory was put in like right across the highway from the housing project. And so she kind of identified all of these little, what she thought of signs of gentrification. And with this redevelopment effort, a couple things that she said were, people were, they put in a new coffee shop that was Tim Hortons, which is a really well-known Canadian coffee shop chain. And that residents in the community weren't welcomed there in the same way, and were told that they just couldn't sit and kind of hang out in the coffee shop in the same way that some of the new middle-class residents, because it was going through this process of redevelopment, which I'll talk about in a minute. And so she was really concerned that the redevelopment of the neighborhood was having uneven impacts and was negatively impacting the previous residents. Another thing that she told me that will just stick with me forever is she said, our community didn't need to be fixed. Our community needed to be resourced. And that was just such a powerful statement, because I think it will speak to what I'll get to, especially when we come to the local context, is so often when we think about housing and housing inequality, we think about tearing down old buildings or tearing down housing that might be outdated, building new housing, but also bringing in new people. And the new people is often a kind of a code word for the middle class. And what was actually needed in the case that kind of Chandra was trying to speak to was, we need resources in this community because we historically have been kind of cut off from access to these resources. And And I just found that to be so kind of powerful. And that's kind of what really...
And you note that it's a thriving community, right?
Yeah.
It has a lot of assets already.
So many people, many of the people that I talked to described the public housing project as being a really thriving space, as feeling safe there, as feeling like they knew their neighbors, they could count on their neighbors. And so through the redevelopment process, what happened was they brought in private developers. So it was a public-private partnership. And the idea was that they would tear down the public housing and rebuild mixed income, mixed tenure housing. So there would be private market units alongside public housing units and subsidized units. However, what became very clear in the process is that the funding model hadn't been quite teased out. So they ended up really diluting the population of low-income folks and folks who needed subsidized housing, and really increasing the rate of those middle-income people who were moving into the neighborhood and who were buying condos. So really, residents had kind of felt, and not all of them, I should say, not all of them, many of them, like this was an example of gentrification. And so in the book, I kind of work through that story, what it means for people. And I actually look at 2 housing projects. So I've only talked about Regent Park, but I also look at a neighborhood called Lawrence Heights, which is a public housing project in Toronto as well. And so I kind of map out what the planning process was, how people experience it on the ground. And the kind of, I think one of the keys to the book is the underlying assumptions that were made about both neighborhoods and the unintended consequences of the redevelopment.
The unintended consequences that eventually occurred.
That's right.
Yeah. And so what were some of those?
Well, I think it was in terms of people's, experiences of feeling like they were bringing in these middle income folks, and that was going to change the actual social fabric of the neighborhood. So I think that's unintended, because the idea is that the introduction of middle income peoples, and this is a really problematic kind of assumption, and there's, all of these debates and research around what is a mixed income housing model when you are introducing a middle income kind of demographic into what was historically a public housing neighborhood. Well, also the underlying assumption there is that there needs to be a mix, and that their middle income folks will influence the quote unquote behavior of low income folks. This is a really classist kind of idea. One of the folks that I worked with in this project said to me, they said, they're not trying to mix the upper income neighborhoods. Which, it causes us to step back, say, what's the underlying assumption there?
There you go.
And then some of the other unintended impacts were around safety and assumptions around criminalization in the neighborhood and who needs to be hyper kind of police, this idea that we need safer neighborhoods, which is true. I support community safety, and many of the residents did too, but they felt like as a result of revitalization and this redevelopment process, that in bringing in middle income folks, that they would actually have a tendency to call the police more because these populations and the populations that were living in the public housing project were already kind of racialized in a particular way and stigmatized and criminalized. So that was one. And then the last unintended impact, I'll say, was around, there was a process of community consultations, which is very popular in urban planning, to kind of call the community in, get their input around what they want their community to look like. And one of the things that I argue in the last chapter of the book is that actually produced exclusion. So they called people in, and that it didn't create the type of meaningful consultation that residents both expected and wanted. And so that it was this kind of orchestrated process that didn't actually take into account residents' ideas or implement them in particular ways. And so that actually produced, through this idea of participation, calling people in to participate, a mode of exclusion.
And in some ways, it does sort of speak to that precarious constructions, right? That precarity ends up being reproduced, not addressed.
That's right.
But then also that exclusion ends up being continuous, in this process that is meant to look like everyone's there, but in reality, they're not, all the voices are not going to be treated equally in that same way. And then what does that future look like then for these communities?
That's right.
As well. And so what do you see in terms of those takeaways from the book project that you did for the kind of work that you're doing here in Holyoke and in the broader Western Mass area, and that for other community members and other scholars could sort of think about, sort of bring to that conversation as well, because it is a very different context, but at the same time, a lot of the sort of general issues that you're addressing sound very familiar, as well.
Yeah, that's a great question. Often when I tell the story, some of the stories that are in the book, and about Regent Park and Lawrence Heights, folks locally here in Holyoke say, I feel like you're talking about Holyoke, or you could be talking about Holyoke. Are you talking about Holyoke? And so I think that's interesting, because we're talking about two very, different contexts nationally, like across borders, demographically very different. But I think some of the takeaways are particularly around the role of the private sector. And in a place like Holyoke, all of this, like, seeking out or thinking about how to quote unquote redevelop the city, what the needs are in the city, and certain attractions, particularly the old mills, is being possible or key sites for redevelopment is something to be really mindful and careful about, because of the impact on the people who live there. So a type of kind of like a green as in cannabis, gentrification. There's another type of green gentrification, but in this case of thinking about the seeking out Holyoke and the mills for cannabis dispensaries. So I think that type of, like, this corporate attraction, the role of the private sector, we should be really mindful of in the local context.
It also sounds like in terms of community voices and what is this looking like?
That's
what are
right.
these mills going to be
That's right.
be used for? How do we make sure that precarious constructions doesn't get reproduced in this context as well? How does that?
right.
How can that happen?
That's right. And I think, we have really strong community organizations here who are trying to address these issues. So if the issue is that we have really old, outdated housing, inadequate housing, substandard housing, how do we address that? And who's seen as deserving of decent housing? Like, if the bar is decent, I mean, that's a pretty low bar. We should be seeking to create housing opportunities for all, where people can thrive. And that's, I don't think is often the framework, is for housing scholars and urban studies scholars. People often say housing is a human right, but I think we have to go past that to think housing is one of our basic human needs, and it's one of the ways that inequality is expressed kind of across the board, and not just reproduced, but I think further entrenched is through housing. So certain people have access to not just housing, but wealth and home ownership. And not that I'm saying that should be the goal, but that housing should be decommodified in order to produce communities that have access to housing and creating an environment where they can thrive. And so in Holyoke, I think, the Western Mass Tenants Union is so strong. We have other community organizations, particularly, I mean, Neighbor to Neighbor, the work that they do is just absolutely transformative. Nueva Esperanza, the kind of more historical, these older organizations have really worked so hard to create, I think, the context for addressing an affordable housing crisis that we see is actually getting worse by the day. It's not getting better, it's getting worse. And then
also connecting it to the climate changes that are happening are even, more, imperative in those conversations. I know that there's some UMass projects and so forth that are taking place, for instance, that are including community residents to sort of hear more about what can be done to address this issue locally and even more regionally and so forth. But making sure that those community voices are there is very key, because we can have all this sort of suggestions and so forth of what can be done, but if it doesn't include the community voices in those conversations, it really is not addressing what's the everyday lived experience of what that looks like.
The everyday lived experience, and then on the flip side of that is the structural causes.
Yes.
Like, how did we get here in the first place? And when we hear from folks in their everyday life and their everyday experiences, we can get to that. So I think that was one thing that was missing in the planning frameworks in Toronto, is that it wasn't addressing the actual structural causes. And if we don't address the historical and structural causes that got us here in the first place, we're going to end up falling short in many ways. And I think that's what we see in both of these cases in Toronto. And I just hope in a place like Holyoke that the resident kind of organizations, Neighbor to Neighbor, Nueva, and other organizations, that they really do pave the way and create space. And it's because they center the experiences and voices of residents. I mean, they don't just center them, they follow them, right?
Yeah, exactly.
One of the things, in this type of work and working in communities that I've learned is, as an academic, I can offer a framework and some analysis, but really our job is to kind of get out of the way, because we've caused more problems than we've solved. Our job is to think about solutions and transformation, but I think we're often part of the problem. And if we were better listeners and caretakers and knew how to kind of step back, that bigger and greater transformation is actually possible.
You mentioned about the structural, sort of the structural issues that sort of got us here in the first place. And what are those? Can you just point a couple of, so what are some of those things, and what have you seen that can be done to address them, or that maybe that you saw afterwards in Toronto, or even here in, if not in the Valley, just even across the U.S.?
Sure.
Like what have you seen that then, what does that addressing look like?
Sure. I think that, some of the structural causes when we think about housing inequality is really comes down to thinking about funding. So built into the policy. So historically here in the US, some of the structural kind of causes would be as a result of redlining, as a result of the GI Bill, which benefited millions of people, but then also left millions of people out from having access to home ownership and even just adequate housing kind of conditions. So
and it was also very racialized.
Very racialized
as well. Yes.
Yep. And so if we go to these kind of historical examples, or even urban disinvestment, like looking at what that did to a city like Holyoke, these are kind of the structural causes. So then thinking about solutions, I think we look to fund different funding opportunities and policy, but also to neighborhood organizations. But one of the things that lacking, and to go back to what Chandra said, our community didn't need to be fixed, our community needed to be resourced. And so where are those resources coming from? What would it look like to having a housing guarantee for all? If we can just imagine that. This is not that far-fetched of an idea. It is possible. It's about a kind of a not just, I don't even want to say a political will, but a social will. Because I think there is an underlying assumption, again, to go back to that framing, that not everybody is deserving of housing, and that housing is a commodity, and that it just represents how hard one is working. And we just know that that's absolutely not the case.
I know. And we're seeing, just across the U.S., so many challenges with housing. You're seeing in the news all the time in terms of folks unable to not just simply even purchase a home, but rent a home, because the rents are skyrocketing and there isn't enough housing to actually, house the many people that need it and so forth, families and single individuals. All kinds of different sort of home context in terms of how families are structured, but folks increasingly feeling the weight and the pressure of, how do I do this? Or how much of my salary or my pay is going towards like housing alone to pay for rent or the mortgage in whatever context they're in. And
in many cases for folks, they're paying more than 50% of their income towards housing. Affordable, for housing to be affordable, they say the metric is usually around 30%. So if we take that, it's almost twice that.
Yeah.
Like, this is creating a dire context. That's a structural problem. And something, the multiple groups in Holyoke have addressed the ways that landlords are raising rent, and really in problematic ways, because what these are, in many contexts, houses that don't have, I don't want to say aren't up to code, but aren't up to what we would think of as having decent living standards. And so you have rents that are over $2,000, and people can't afford that. And the landlords are not maintaining the buildings. So this is, again, where I say, if we have to look at the private sector. One of my colleagues has this beautiful piece that came out last year, Preston Smith, called Race in the Housing Question. And part of what he says is we have to look to real estate. Like, we have to look to the real estate industry, because they are so central to the problem in terms of rising rents, the quality of housing, and so on and so forth.
Well, Vanessa, I know we're running out of time, and I'm so appreciative of you taking the time to, come here to connect and also talk about your work and your journey and how you became a professor, a scholar, because I think that it's so critical for us to have these spaces for these kinds of conversations. And I just want to note again her book, so I encourage people to check it out, because it really is not only so important for thinking what is happening in other communities and how is it relevant and important in the community that I'm located in, but also beautifully written as well. So I just love reading it, and I know you're going to be doing other work, coming down the pike in the next several years as well. So I don't know if you want to share any final words before we wrap up.
I'm just so grateful. Thanks for the space. Thank you
Yeah.
for inviting me. And I can't wait to do this again. I feel like we could talk all day.
Absolutely.
So we need more time next time.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us, and we'll be in touch again soon with Que Onda. Again, this is Dr. Mari Castañeda and my dear friend, Dr. Vanessa Rosa here today. And thank you for joining us.